shopping locations in the region. Included in that category would be places like Indonesia, Vietnam and India have historically had relatively high salary increases. China doesn't actually have the highest salary increase in the region this year. That honour goes to both India and Vietnam, where salary increases will be in double digits. They'll be somewhere between 11 or 12%. But one of the reasons why salaries are rising in China at a relatively fast rate is because this is coupled with economic growth. As the economy is growing at rates of between 8, 9 and 10% per annum over the course of the last 10 years, that obviously feeds through to people's expectations in terms of their income. If they see that the economy is growing, again, people are expecting to see their salaries increasing at a similar rate as well. Likewise, as these markets are growing, and China is indicative of this, we also see this elsewhere, and as mentioned, India is another example, where as the economy is growing, companies are seeing a demand for talent, or there is a war for talent in terms of companies needing to attract and retain the right people. So therefore, this is also feeding through to employee expectations of salary increases. So therefore, they're much more likely to drive a harder bargain when they're looking to renew or looking to review their salaries in both this year, last year, previous years. And because of the rate of growth in China, companies have retention issues, and they know that if they can't keep pace with what other companies are offering, as new competitors enter the market, new multinational competitors, new local competitors enter the market, as new competitors enter the market, companies obviously have to pay higher salaries, which are increasing at a much faster rate than they are in developed economies, places like Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, in order to retain these staff and stop them from moving to a competitor. Inflation in China is being driven by the same factors that's driving inflation elsewhere. On the one hand, it's the price of the items that you purchase in a supermarket. And it's really the factors of production which go into those. So you're looking at the price of your basic materials, your basic ingredients such as meat, fish, fruit, vegetables. And obviously these are raw products which are then ingredients of many other processed foods. So again, they feed through to the price of processed foods in China. So everything that you see on the supermarket shelves, from the price of your raw produce all the way through to your processed produce, is increasing because of the cost of these basic necessities. However, this then feeds through into other items. So, for example, it feeds through into employee wage expectations. As the price that I'm paying in the supermarket is increasing, I as an employee are therefore expecting that my salary needs to increase at a much faster rate to maintain or to protect my purchasing power. And as we see in China, where employees have a much greater bargaining power because of the war for talent, that leads to what we see known as a wage price spiral, where because prices increase, wages increase, but wages become a factor of production, have a considerable impact. We've seen in recent years, and this has been accelerated in the course of the last 12 to 18 months, active policies and processes being made by the government to increase the consumption power of the Chinese people. Now, up until recently, the main driver of China's growth has been investment in fixed assets, such as infrastructure, property, railways, air networks, and so on. And that's driven the GDP growth rates in China for the last 10 to 20 years. However, this has created what's seen as an imbalanced economy, where you have very good infrastructure, but the wages of most people are left behind. And that actually acts as a deterrent, well, rather than a deterrent, it acts as a hurdle to China's continued development. If, for example, the general population are unable to afford basic necessities, then they have no consumption power. So basically, the Chinese government has learned from other economies, Europe, the US, Japan, in that you need a large local population with a high consumption power in order to continue to drive your economy. And one of the ways in which that can happen is through increasing the wages of your average employee. It's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's bad. If salaries are increasing, costs are increasing. Obviously, there are ways for companies to manage costs. You increase productivity. So we've seen that over the course of the last 10 years in China, salaries of white-collar workers have increased by an average of 7, 8 or 9% each year for the last 10 years. So that actually represents almost a doubling of salaries, at least, over the course of the last 5 to 10 years. But China still remains a low-cost location, a competitive location, because while salaries have increased, while the salaries that are paid to workers increases, employees have become much more productive through productivity gains. So the actual cost of providing items or purchasing items, or rather the cost that companies in China can charge for items, actually hasn't changed, because while the cost of one of the factors of production being labour has actually increased in terms of the wages, they're more productive. So higher costs do not necessarily feed through or do not automatically make the product that's being sold more expensive. But if we do see the cost of products becoming out of China becoming more expensive, that will have two impacts. First, some economies will benefit. So those industries where it no longer is economically viable to produce in China because it's cheaper to produce elsewhere, they'll benefit. So these will be low salary, low cost locations elsewhere in Asia. And examples of this will be places like Cambodia, places like Vietnam, as well as places in the subcontinent such as Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, even Myanmar, where we've started to see an offshoring of certain industries, particularly low-skilled industries such as garment and basic manufacturing. Also, it means that some of the items that are now being produced, because China obviously produces items, but in many cases they do what's known as semi-production. Those items are then finished elsewhere. So if those costs are increasing, then that also has an impact on other companies which are based elsewhere. So, for example, if I produce disk drives in China and they're then assembled in a factory in Malaysia or in a factory in Singapore, if the cost of those disk drives are becoming more expensive, then that means that the company that's purchasing those disk drives in Malaysia or Singapore, they obviously have to pay more for those if they can't get them from elsewhere. And that again has an impact on the cost, their cost of production. So it's a double-edged sword. Some economies will benefit because they'll see an offshoring of certain industries to these economies, but other economies will lose. But then on the other hand, other economies will also gain. Again, as China is developing, as more and more people have higher incomes, they travel overseas much more. So places like Hong Kong, Singapore, Japan, Korea, even Taiwan, all around the region, they're now much more likely to target the Chinese tourist dollar because they're actually, with their relatively high purchasing power and their high spending pattern, or their high spending power, they're actually replacing many other nationalities as the tourist of choice for many economies in the region. Hong Kong's prosperity is very closely linked to China, probably more so than any other economy in the region. Hong Kong often competes or often compares itself with Singapore, for example. Now, while both economies are very close in terms of, or rather very dependent on China's growth, Singapore has actually diversified more. It works, or it invests not just in China, but it also invests in Southeast Asia, the subcontinent, the Middle East. And so businesses which are based in Singapore are not so reliant on China as Hong Kong businesses. So the economy in Hong Kong is heavily dependent on China. For example, the tourist industry. China now makes up the majority of tourists in Hong Kong, and they have the highest spending power out of all tourists in Hong Kong. So if there's a recession in China, and this obviously has an impact on people's purchasing power, that's going to cause the tourist industry in Hong Kong to suffer. Likewise, many companies in Hong Kong, they are heavily invested in China, banking, finance, property development. So again, any slowdown in China will have a considerable, or will have a direct impact on the fortunes of both the Hong Kong people as well as the Hong Kong businesses as well.